Welcome. My name is Mark Shamming. I'm director of the New York State Museum. We had a long day. We had the Emancipation Proclamation on exhibition. If you're in Albany tomorrow, I would encourage you to come see it. We had, and if I'm hoarse, it's because we had somewhere about 1,000 school children in the lobby until about noon today. And that matters because we have Harold Holzer with us tonight. So I'm here to introduce Harold. Harold Holzer, good evening. His voice is heard everywhere in this museum and all things Lincoln. Most recently, he was involved with the development of the Emancipation Proclamation exhibition that's on view here. It was at 8 other cities across the state. And he authored this with our commissioner, John King, and Khalil Muhammad from the Schomburg Center. He's also a great contributor to an irrepressible conflict, the Empire State in the Civil War, an exhibition that I would encourage you to view if you haven't already in the museum's South Hall galleries. I was thinking today, in 1990, I was in this room with Harold Holzer for the first time with Governor Mario Cuomo when they unveiled the publication, a new book, Lincoln on Democracy. And I remember then Governor Mario Cuomo wanted to book a room, and we were going to give him the Clark Theater, and he said, no, let's fill the Huxley, and we did. And it was a great lesson for me, and it was the first time I think Harold set foot in the museum, and we've done many projects since. Harold Holzer is the author of 42, I think now 43 books about Lincoln that he's been part of. He's written over 500 articles about Lincoln. He embodies Lincoln in every way possible, and he's fascinating to talk. And I can tell you, I'd rather speak before than after him because he's a daunting figure when it comes to speaking. He's a great friend of this museum, of this governor, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Harold Holzer.
Good evening. What a great-looking crowd. I can't see you now, but I saw you from back here. And you're so nice to come out on a Friday night in this room. This was the room that we announced and published and introduced Lincoln on Democracy in, I guess it was 1990. I looked it up for Mark today. So 1990, 22 years ago. And it calls to mind just briefly one of the people who was in that room. And I sort of would like to dedicate this talk to him because he died last Friday, but at the age of 100. And his name was Richard Nelson Current. He was one of the great Lincoln scholars of the 20th century. And he was not only part of the Lincoln on Democracy project, but the reason I mention him at all is, but frequently, is that when I was in 5th grade in Queens, in New York City, I got an assignment, as did we all in our 5th grade class, to pick a name out of a hat and write I guess we called it a composition in those days, a biographical composition. And I picked Lincoln out of my teacher, Mrs. Janke's hat. I always say that my friend Dennis, who was right behind me, picked Genghis Khan, and he wound up as a rock and roll promoter. That sort of doesn't really track, but it always gets a laugh, so I keep doing it. And I went up to our school library and found a book called The Lincoln Nobody Knows by Richard Nelson Current. And it's, I hope everybody finds a book that changes their lives, because that changed my life. And I got to know him and invite him to work on the Lincoln on Democracy project, and he lived a great, long life. But I think people will miss him. But read The Lincoln Nobody Knows. It's still a fantastic book. So here we are, literally at the cusp of the Age of Spielberg, which will start in 12 hours, when Spielberg's Lincoln opens to the public tomorrow. I don't know how many of you have seen notices or things on television today, but they've been all over television. They're desperate for angles, because I even got to be on television. On CBS this morning, this morning, and it is already changing what people are. It's changing the discourse about Abraham Lincoln. People want to know what he sounded like, what he looked like. 3 weeks ago, people were asking me if Daniel Day-Lewis actually made himself look like Lincoln. Today, they're asking if Lincoln looked like Daniel Day-Lewis. So that's twisted. He is the new paradigm. But it's wonderful to talk about it. And in the question period, you can certainly ask about the movie and my little role in it, which was to be a content consultant. That's the way I'm billed at the end of 9.5 minutes of credits. I don't know who is going to sit for that. My wife and I did, because I wouldn't let her leave. And then she pointed out that people are going to think that I was a content consultant. And then she said, don't worry, nobody who knows you will think you are a content consultant. But it's worth going to, I must say. So we can talk about that. But as much as we talk about the fictionalization of Lincoln, and it is fictionalization, it's the work of a fabulous playwright, Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America. But he approaches it the way Shakespeare approached history. He's not out to replicate the lines that we know. It's not like the D.W. Griffith Lincoln, where Abraham Lincoln, in the guise of Walter Houston, walks through the halls and says, government of the Mary, we must have government of the people, by the people, for the people. This is imagined out of the genius of Tony Kushner, with the scenes coming out of the genius of Steven Spielberg. And it's miraculous because it's not about what we know as filtered through a movie maker's eye. It's really through the ear of the screenplay as well. And it's totally different and extraordinary. With all that, with all the focus on the fictionalization and the film, we're here in a place that has the most extraordinary collection of authentic materials. To me, the test of a great exhibition, that Mark and his team have certainly put on a great exhibition, but the test of a great exhibition, for me, a Civil War exhibition, is to walk through and find things that I've never seen before in my life after doing this kind of thing for 40 years. And I found 3 or 4 that I've never seen, some of which I'm angry at Mark for not showing me before. But one of the most amazing things is that, I don't know if you saw this little medal that was cast in tribute to the veterans of Fort Sumter as they arrived back in New York City just a few days later, with Robert Anderson saying he didn't know whether he was going to be court-martialed or given a parade. And he was given a parade. Wonderful piece that I never knew existed. But most of all, in this very building and in that very gallery outside, we got to see, I hope all of you got to see or have seen, the Emancipation Proclamation. The first public expression of a revolution in the American government. The first published attestation that America would never be the same even if reunited, and a great revolutionary document and a radical, controversial document in its day. But the Emancipation Proclamation, I hope through this exhibition and through these discussions, is making a comeback. I think it's fair to say that for 75 years, its reputation has been in decline. I think it's never in decline by people who get close to that talismanic relic and can feel the power and see the struggle. I think for Lincoln, a struggle to write down, to write in a legalistic way that was not natural to him anymore, to dot all the I's and cross all the T's so that his reasoning was not challenged in the courts, instead of writing as soaringly as we know he was capable of writing in his great works defending freedom. And I'll get to that a little later. But Richard Hofstadter in the 1940s, a Columbia University professor, really hurt the reputation of this document when he said, after reviewing it, that it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, a cargo receipt. And when I look back at the reputation of the proclamation over the years, I found that it had in fact been criticized severely, even by admirers of what it accomplished, because of the way it was written. Karl Marx, of all people, who was a Lincoln admirer in Europe, said that the style of the proclamation reminded him of the mean, pettifogging conditions which one lawyer puts to his opposing lawyers. So what a great moment to explore the true meaning of the proclamation and the true power of those words, however legalistic. We've just passed through a period of the 150th anniversary of this document that largely has remained in the vaults here in the New York State Library and Museum over the years. Mark Shamming, and working at Governor Cuomo's instruction, has gotten this document around New York State in the last few months. I think more people have cast their eyes on it than have ever seen it in the history of this country, because the document has remained basically sealed up, and it's great to see it out there. But I want to suggest that its reputation was impaired in a way even in its time. And I think we have only one person to blame for it, and it's not Karl Marx, and it's not Richard Hofstadter. It's actually Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not suggesting that he could have written it in an other than legalistic way to withstand court challenges which he thought were going to occur. And Abraham Lincoln knew its power. He said, if my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act. But he accompanied it, or more accurately preceded it, with a series of very strange run-up actions and declarations that confused the American people at the time and have certainly served to give fodder for Lincoln's critics ever since. Critics who contend that he was not a sincere liberator, that he didn't care about slavery, and certainly not about slaves, and more broadly, not about people of color. That what he did to win the Civil War, to destroy the Confederacy, and to save the Union, with no interest at all in his impact on slavery. And certainly, analysts looking at it have pointed to its limited reach. It reached and affected only those states in rebellion against the federal authority. It exempted slaveholding Upper South states. Of course, that prose, but most of all, the actions that preceded it, as I mentioned a second ago. Well, to understand the actions and what Lincoln meant by them, I think requires a leap of historical perspective. You have to think about 1862, not about 2012. And in 1862, military failure and political unrest characterized the political milieu of the day. The Union armies had been repeatedly unsuccessful, and Lincoln is increasingly convinced that he has an opportunity not only to destroy slavery, but to save the Union with an executive order that can end slavery once and for all in the states that had raised their sword against the Union, against majority rule, as he kept saying. And little steps occur. D.C. emancipation in April 1862, the first time an American president ever signed his name on a document that limited slavery. April 1862, still a holiday in the District of Columbia, which is why, for those of you who may remember back to last April, we got a tax holiday of 2 days this year, because D.C. emancipation is a serious, serious holiday in Washington, and even the IRS closes on D.C. emancipation. We should have it more often, I guess. So as that occurs, as D.C. emancipation occurs, Lincoln gets to sign yet another piece of legislation that bans slavery in the new Western territories, something he's been advocating ever since 1854, 8 years of opposition to expanding slavery. But he's still not at a place where he thinks he can move. Why not? Because the Union military keeps losing and putting him in a position of weakness. The Virginia Peninsula was the scene of the most recent disaster. George McClellan had moved the Army of the Potomac against Richmond. bogged down, which is a charitable way of talking about his command activities, and no progress made, ending in a humiliating defeat and a retreat, which McClellan blamed on Abraham Lincoln. At the same time, he audaciously reminded Lincoln that he was not prepared to fight a war to end slavery, but only to save the Union. He remains very popular with his troops. What soldier would not love a general who doesn't let you fight? Keeps you safe and digging trenches and all of that, and marching and drilling. McClellan was extremely popular. And this is a man who is a Democrat in politics, whispered as a rival of Lincoln 2 years down the road for the presidency, or at least a candidate for president. I'm not sure that re-election was being discussed so early. But the Army is opposed to expanding the war to become a war against slavery. Yes, of course, there are people clamoring for Lincoln to act. So-called radical Republicans, I've always hated that term because it implies that the liberal advanced Republicans in the Congress were somehow radical and crazed, when in fact they were simply philosophically advanced on matters of race and emancipation, and they were pushing Lincoln. At the same time, McClellan telling Lincoln face to face, our soldiers will not fight. Well, what does Lincoln do? He decides to take matters into his own hand in a slightly different way. He calls in the congressmen from the border states, from the loyal border states like Maryland and Delaware and Missouri and Kentucky. States where slavery is legal, but the state governments are not in active rebellion. And Lincoln knows how vital they are to keeping the war at least bottled up in the Deep South. As he famously said, I would like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. So he calls in these congressmen in early July 1862. He says to them, I would like to offer you a proposal for compensated emancipation. This government will pay you for your slaves, as we did in Washington, D.C., $300 a person. It was painful to have mothers and fathers and children parading before an assessor who looks at them and guesses their value. But it's the only way. Gentlemen, let us do it. And they say to him, you can't afford to do it. You're fighting a war. And he says to them, I'm paraphrasing, this war is costing $1.5 million a day. It's much less expensive for me to buy the human property that you've been keeping in subjugation. So they go back and caucus and overwhelmingly vote to reject Abraham Lincoln's plan. They will, in the end, get no compensation, and they did themselves in by rejecting that compromise. So Lincoln tells a Mississippi visitor not long after, a pro-Union Mississippian, we're beaten. We must change our tactics and strike that blow against slavery. A blow that I think he was always emotionally prepared to strike, but constitutionally restrained from striking. So on July 22nd, 1862, he calls his cabinet into session. In the session that is portrayed in that graphic that was hanging over the document this evening, and will be back out tomorrow. Calls the cabinet into session and reads them a draft of an order based on the recent Congressional Confiscation Acts, which I probably should have mentioned earlier. Congress has passed 2 acts confiscating property, which some people think is enough to end slavery in America, but Lincoln did not think would work because it left adjudication to the courts, and there were no federal courts functioning in the South, of course. So Lincoln thought it was really a paper tiger. But he reads his draft to the cabinet. That draft is in the Library of Congress. And extraordinarily, this famous team of rivals, as Doris Goodwin has described it, many of whom were more advanced in abolition circles than Lincoln, to a man, tells Lincoln, basically, are you mad? You can't do this now. You've just lost on the peninsula. We've humiliated. Montgomery Blair, his postmaster general, whose father is a co-star of the movie, the Lincoln movie, Montgomery Blair says, you will be doomed in the off-year elections in just a few months. The Republican Party will be just decimated. In fact, they were. Salmon Chase, an abolitionist Secretary of the Treasury, said this is not the right time. And then William Seward, our former governor of New York, his Secretary of State, his closest aide, says to him, you cannot do this out of a position of weakness. It will be considered our last shriek on the retreat. So Lincoln, rather sadly, a beaten man, folds up the document and puts it in his pocket. It's July 22nd, and he waits. In those days, presidents actually submitted to votes policy decisions, the way that you always read in Israel, there's a cabinet vote on a policy. We had cabinet votes on policies too, and this was one that Lincoln did not succeed in. But he never believed from that moment forward that the time would not come when he could do it. Issue an executive order as commander-in-chief. So he begins to prepare, and he prepares in two ways. First, he writes a longer document, a more detailed document, the one we saw tonight and we'll see tomorrow here in the State Museum. But then he begins setting the stage in public relations terms in ways that he thought were needed to prepare citizens of the Union to this idea that he was acting only as a military commander-in-chief and not as a philanthropist, not as someone who cared about African Americans. Why did he do it? Because I think he took to heart what Montgomery Blair told him. He's got to stay in power. He can't just act on his heartfelt feelings. He has an election coming up. He has a presidency to save. He won with 39% of the popular vote in 1860, with off-year elections coming up. Even in the North, he only won 53 or 54% of the vote. So he is not exactly operating from a position of power. So what he does is he begins managing a systematic series of messages to the American people that have clouded his reputation as a liberator by suggesting that he wasn't terribly interested in the act that he was about to author and to publish, to promote. They seemed clumsy, they seemed disingenuous, some of them seemed rather hurtful, but it was a campaign, again, aimed at white Americans who voted, not African Americans who would be ultimately the beneficiaries of whatever he did. So what did he do? Well, he begins this disinformation campaign. And on August 22nd, exactly 1 month after the cabinet meeting, the editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, gives him a great opening by writing a letter to the by publishing an editorial called The Prayer of 20 Millions, in which he says that the administration has been strangely and disastrously remiss in not using its power to destroy slavery. Just get rid of the home front manpower in the South. So Lincoln seizes on this and writes the most famous letter to the editor in American presidential history. Nowadays, presidents just go on television. In those days, they wrote letters to the editor. And he wrote, what I do to save the Union. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could save the Union by freeing no slaves, I would. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. And it ended with this saying, this does not change my personal view that all men everywhere should be free. And then he stuck it to Greeley by having it published in another newspaper first. Now, there is a backstory to this that I found interesting, and I did this in a book I published before my little Spielberg young adult book, which I should be promoting, but I'm not. I'm talking about Emancipation. Greeley, I think, had found out that Lincoln had written the proclamation and was getting ready to issue it. And Greeley wanted to be in a position to have written an editorial that Lincoln might be construed to have followed. So then Greeley would become the hero of liberation, not Lincoln. So Lincoln gave it back to him by saying, what I do to save the Union. And Greeley turned to a friend and said, oh, your old Abe is too smart for me. I think he knew. And I think Lincoln at this point, even with the Greeley letter, is beginning to tell people about the proclamation. Some people say there's one diarist named Adam Gorowski who writes he writes it in Latin, vulgati or whatever. It's all over town. It's a Latin expression that means all over town. There are little hints. He brings in people and tells them. which is why I think Greeley knew, because he told one of Greeley's correspondents in Washington about it, and then said, of course, it's a big secret. But with all due respect to journalists here, it's not exactly the best way to keep a secret, is to tell them a secret. So that's step one. Then in August comes maybe the most depressing of his political feints. He asks a delegation of free people of color to visit him in the White House. Now, the good news on this event is that it was the first time that a delegation of free African Americans had ever visited the White House to meet a president of the United States. The bad news is what Lincoln did when they arrived. With an Associated Press reporter at his side, he basically says to them, "You are the reason why we're having this terrible civil war. It's because of you. If you were not in this country, there would be no problem, and there would be no war, and white people would not be killing each other. Go where the ban is not upon you. It is best for us to be separated." And he says, "I have a plan." We've heard that before, right? "I have a plan. And my plan is that you go to a place in Central America, which we will finance, and you can start your own society, and we will support you, and there will be no prejudice against you there, because you will be with only your own people." And very politely, these people, who were distinguished citizens of Washington, ministers, they'd been in America every bit as long as Abraham Lincoln's family had been in America, they said, "Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to take our leave, and we will consider it." And they went back and they wrote a very eminently polite letter saying, "We have thought about it, but we are citizens of Washington, D.C., and we intend to remain so." Frederick Douglass, when he read this exchange, he wrote that Lincoln was guilty of pride of race and blood, contempt for Negroes, and canting hypocrisy. "Slavery has caused the war," he wrote in Douglass's Monthly, "not slaves. Slavery, not slaves." Now, the irony on Douglass is that he published that after the proclamation had been issued. It just came out late. But why did Lincoln do this? What was the point? Because in the end, out of this congressional appropriation of about $7 million for colonization, which he did believe in as a young man, and he was never a member of the Colonization Society, but he was a great supporter of Henry Clay, who invented this whole idea, helped invent it. He only spent about $400,000 of that money. But he felt he needed to reassure white America that that emancipation would not mean equality, citizenship, or a biracial society. It's not pleasant to think about that that's what preceded that great document, but it is the political reality, and it was Lincoln's certainly a political decision with a journalist, a Associated Press reporter standing at his side, and that story went all over the country. And by the way, many white journalists wrote that it was a very wise statement to make. Hurtful to some, encouraging to the vast majority of white people in America. And of course, right after that, the Second Battle of Bull Run occurs, and it is not the battle that's going to give Lincoln the opportunity to issue the proclamation, because again the Union suffers another humiliating defeat, and Lincoln waits further still. One more thing happens. A group of ministers arrives in August to the White House. I think that most delegations should have just avoided him at this point, because he is boiling, keeping it bottled up, but boiling with anxiety about what is going to happen when he does when he pulls the trigger, because he's confident that there will be a military victory. And he tells these ministers, I don't know what God's will is. If I can find out, I'll do it. What good would a proclamation from me do? It would be like the Pope's bull against the comet. There was a pope named Calixtus in the 15th century who issued a bull forbidding Halley's comet to arrive. And of course, the next day, the skies went dark. He said, I'm not giving up on emancipation, but I'm not sure it would have an effect. A confusing message again. He's admitting futility, anxiety, almost weakness in a way that leaders don't do today. I mean, no one apologizes. No one says that they're wrestling with the problem because, it gets covered all day on Fox and MSNBC. But in those days, when Lincoln made these comments and they were published, it was the same thing as Fox and MSNBC in those days because it got reported very, very quickly. Now Lincoln learns in early September that Robert E. Lee has decided to take the Confederacy on the offensive. And there's an invasion of Maryland, an invasion of the slaveholding North. And Robert E. Lee expects that he's going to be greeted like a savior when he arrives in white Maryland. His mistake was that he came through western Maryland, which was not sympathetic to slavery, rather than the eastern Maryland, which was, and he was rather shocked at the hostility that he encountered. But as we all know, the Union and the Confederate armies converged at Sharpsburg, Maryland, at the Battle of Antietam on September 17th. And there, in one of the great ironies of American history, General George B. McClellan, the man who failed on the Virginia Peninsula, delaying freedom by another few months, the man who said I won't fight for freedom, meets Robert E. Lee, and if not overwhelmingly defeating him, at least beat him back to a hasty retreat into Virginia. And Lincoln pulls the trigger 5 days later. People wonder, why did he wait 5 days? Why did he just, people are enslaved. Why don't you move? Well, a few reasons have been advanced. One is that he's in the country. He's living in the soldiers' home outside of Washington, and he's got to write it and finish it, the document we see. And the second reason is that it's a weekend, and everybody knows you can't get good press on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It comes in on Monday, and maybe he also wanted to. I have a friend from Harvard, and they think in their own unique ways. I'll never forget when Mario Cuomo was here and the scholars were all arrayed here. He said, well, we have one man from Harvard, one man from Yale, and one man from Princeton. And he said, thank God I'm here to represent St. John's. That was, I just thought of that. So he calls the cabinet together on September 22nd. So my Harvard friend, he thinks everything had to be on the 22nd. July 22nd was the first cabinet meeting. August 22nd was the Greeley letter. September 22nd is the cabinet meeting and the announcement. Well, I'm not sure. And why? Because he was cognizant of it being known as Washington's birthday, the 22nd. I think it's a little far-fetched. So maybe Mario Cuomo is right. It's a Harvard thing. He calls the cabinet in, and this time he doesn't ask for a vote. This time, he first reads from a joke book, torturing these people, and then he says, gentlemen, I have a solemn thing to convey to you. When Lee invaded Maryland, I made a pact with God that if the enemy were defeated, I would act against slavery. And the enemy having been defeated, that promise must be kept. I will now read what I've written to you, and I'm not asking for your opinion. If you have any suggestions for amendments or refinements, I'm willing to listen, but this act will be done today. And he read it. Corrections were suggested by Secretary Seward and others, Secretary Chase. You can see the penciled corrections in the document that's on display here. And within hours, he had called for a scribe who wrote it up as an official document, affixed the seal of the United States, and gave 100 days' notice to the Confederacy. End the rebellion or forfeit all of your human property, not only immediately, but afterwards and forever. Then, thenceforward, and forever. Now, Frederick Douglass was in a way disappointed because he said he was hoping for a language out of Leviticus. But in the preliminary proclamation and the final, I don't think Lincoln was hesitant. I think he was determined, but I think he was always worried about legal challenges. He had bypassed Congress, which had shown it wasn't going to act, by making it an executive order as commander-in-chief. He wanted to get the courts out of the picture by firmly rooting it in his constitutional war powers, as he put it. He had consulted experts on executive power. He had pamphlets written supporting his assumption of of power, and the result was prosaic. But my view is that Lincoln very soon offered the poetry to augment the deadly prose, the legalistic prose. Just a few months later, after another, or at the approach of another Union defeat at Fredericksburg that would have probably deflected most people and had others, weaker and less resolute presidents, cancel the order, he said, "We cannot escape history. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." And we all know at Gettysburg, he rose to the occasion and defended the proclamation in the most extraordinary way in any political speech ever written. One great speech that I think is neglected because it's always listed in the Lincoln canon as a letter is a speech he wrote in 1863 before Gettysburg to be delivered in his hometown of Springfield, whose citizens had never really supported him, was always a 50-50 city. And now he learned they were opposed to the most radical call in the proclamation for the enlistment of African-American soldiers. That was in the final proclamation. And Lincoln wrote an extraordinary speech, but determined that he was too busy to go to Springfield. It would have been 6 days out of his life, and he needed to stay close to the telegraph office. So he wrote it as a letter to a friend in Springfield and said, "Read this very slowly." It's the only clue we have to how Lincoln liked speeches read, which is why he took 2 hours to give the Cooper Union address. And when we recreated it in 2005, it took 1 hour because we had microphones and people don't read that slowly anymore. It said, "I know you dislike my Emancipation Proclamation. Some of you don't wish to fight to free Negroes. Well, some of them seem willing to fight for you. And when we win this war, and we will, there will be those who will say that African-American troops helped us on to this grand consummation with firmly held bayonet and clenched teeth, while some of you will be charged with deterring it." I paraphrase again, but this is the same man who had spoken to that delegation of free African Americans 11 months before. He'd become a champion of freedom. I just want to leave you with and then take a few questions if you would like to ask about anything. With a wonderful scene that I think is an unforgettable scene, and to lead up to it is to remember that he issues the September Proclamation, the one New York State owns, and it's going to become due in 100 days when he has to write a final proclamation. And there are many people. The editorial assaults against the Preliminary Proclamation are unbelievable. Democratic newspapers attack him as a tyrant run amok, a man who's exciting race wars. He was attacked in the British press. He's attacked everywhere. And then comes the Battle of Fredericksburg and a military disaster. And there are many people who think that he's not going to follow through. So on January 1st, he writes the new proclamation, augments it, gets changes, and gives it to a scribe, probably on December 31st, actually. And on January 1st, it's brought to his second-floor office. There's no Oval Office then. It was what's now the Lincoln bedroom. And it's unrolled in front of him, and he reads it. And he reads it really carefully. And he sees at the very end of it, in the template that just says, "In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed," language that had been used in 50 proclamations during the last 2 years. The language was wrong. Some words were transposed. He let it roll up and he said, "It's got to be perfect. I know it's a holiday. Wake the guy up." He said it in a different way, I'm sure. And then it was time for the annual New Year's reception at the White House. So Abraham Lincoln went down, joined his wife, to receive for about 2 hours Washington's elite, diplomats, generals in uniform, members of the cabinet, high-level members of government. And then after that, the doors of the White House are thrown open, and anyone in the public can come and shake the president's hand. And they did. Thousands of people lined up for a free drink and a chance to see Abraham Lincoln and say Happy New Year. Well, by now, it's 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Since midnight, African Americans and abolitionist whites have been gathered at churches, at pro-freedom churches throughout the North. It was called the midnight hour. They expected word. Midnight, 8 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., nothing. Is he going to do it? Is he going to sign it? And then the revised scroll comes back. He unrolls it. There's no one in the room except Seward's son, Frederick, who is his personal secretary, and Lincoln's private secretary. 3 witnesses. And Lincoln reads it. Everyone sort of is holding their breath. And Lincoln says, it's fine. And he takes his pen and dips it in an inkwell and takes it out and then puts the pen down. And then he picks up the pen and then he puts it down again. What must have been going through these people's minds? Is he not going to do it? And finally, he looks up and he says, I've been shaking hands for 4 hours and my right arm is almost paralyzed. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act. And I don't want anyone to look at the signature, think it's tremulous, and conclude he hesitated. So for the next 10 minutes, he massaged his hands together, these big, enormous paws, just circling around and bringing the feeling back. And then he picked up his pen, he wrote Abraham Lincoln, and he looked down and he said, there, that will do. And that was the moment that people had been waiting for. Only then did word go out on the telegraph wires to these people who had been so anxiously awaiting word in churches throughout the North and to newspapers. Only then was it released in this dramatic moment. I know that the Spielberg movie concentrates on the next act, Act 3, the 13th Amendment, and it's a dramatic story that needed to be told because Lincoln played a huge role in ending slavery everywhere by pushing Congress to pass a resolution sending the 13th Amendment to the states. But that New Year's Day moment, that moment of hesitation. Now the irony is that signature that he wanted to be brilliant and perfect for eternity has all but vanished in time because those so-called engrossed documents that people signed, that people prepared, were done on this fancy vellum paper where the ink invariably faded. And this one has. But the document that Lincoln read to his cabinet on September 22nd, asking them to keep their opinions to themselves because he's thought about it, which he wrote on the equivalent of what we would call legal pads, foolscap paper, a little longer than a legal pad, but it's just ordinary scrap paper, lined scrap paper. That has endured perfectly. And as you know, he donated it to a charity fair in Albany in 1864. 1,000 raffle tickets were bought by one man, the abolitionist Gerrit Smith, and he won it. And then he sold it to the New York State Legislature. Jack, anyone who questions the ability of the New York State Legislature to act when it has to act, I don't think Jack had begun serving yet, but came in with the Spanish-American War, I think. But the legislature acted that day and gave Gerrit Smith back his $1,000, and New York State owned and cherished and protected that document. He donated the final proclamation to a charity fair in Chicago, and the Chicago fire cost us that document in Lincoln's hand. But New York State, even during the Capitol fire of 1911, when some brave troopers rescued it, along with other precious relics of our state heritage, saved that document, and boy, it's pristine and it's beautiful. And Mark Shamming and the governor made sure that it's available and visible, and Christine Ward and Bob Bullock at the State Archives found this amazing Martin Luther King typescript with his handwritten emendations, in which he, 100 years after emancipation and 50 years ago, took his view of it and said, in ways that I think are worth remembering as people still grapple with how effective it was and how revolutionary it was. If our nation had done nothing more in its whole history than to create just 2 documents, its contribution to civilization would be imperishable. The first is the Declaration of Independence, and the other is that which we are here to honor tonight, the Emancipation Proclamation. All tyrants, past, present, and future, are powerless to bury the truths in these declarations, no matter how extensive their legions, how vast their power, and how malignant their evil. And then Dr. King said, in ways that continue to ring true 50 years after he said these words and 150 years after the proclamation was issued, there is but one way to commemorate the Emancipation Proclamation. That is to make its declarations of freedom real, to reach back to the origins of our nation when our message of equality electrified an unfree world, and reaffirm democracy by deeds as bold and daring as the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Thank you. Thank you. So, do we have time for a few questions? Okay. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
The vellum copies were made how many, and what about Hawaii?
Oh, you love that Honolulu story, right? You know, I have a friend, a historian named James Horton, who spends half of his year until he retired teaching in Hawaii, and for years he's been telling me, "What about the emancipation thing in Hawaii?" And I kept saying, "Yeah." I mean, I'd never dreamed that this thing existed until the state museum and the state archives put this exhibition together. But it is, in fact, when Lincoln wrote the proclamation we saw outside, that's on view here, he then had to get it out to the press. So he wrote an order to that famous scribe, whoever that poor guy was, saying, please prepare this as an official order. And that slip of paper is in the Honolulu State Archives. Don't ask me how it got there. Maybe James Horton brought it there. But then there was a formal document of the Preliminary Proclamation, which lives in the National Archives, which is faded because it's on that vellum paper. So that's the Hawaii story. It's sort of a bi-coastal and beyond story. Yes, sir.
In terms of a war measure, in terms of prosecuting the war, how was it successful in doing that? How did it aid them?
How successful was it as a war measure? Well, it was successful both as a war measure and as a humanitarian measure. Of course, the 13th Amendment concluded the work and ended any debate about its enforcement. But what the proclamation did is give an added meaning, an added rationale, an added crusade to the Civil War. Lincoln made sure that emancipation was now going to be part of the Union Army march and the Union advance. He actually ordered the printing of tiny Emancipation Proclamations. I'm sure there's one probably in this collection or in the archives, and gave them in bulk to Union regiments, and they carried them around. And the idea was, and it sounds a little simplistic, but when they got to a home or a town or a plantation where there were enslaved people, they would say, we have this for you. Take a look. These people are free, and we'd be really happy if the men could join our ranks and the women could become cooks. And they left with the army. It did have an impact. Out of 4 million or so enslaved people, the proclamation itself probably freed about, my guess is between 500,000 and 800,000 people. About 60,000 on January 1st, 1863. And then as the Union Army marched with their documents on the trail, people were liberated and did join. I mean, remember, of the 200,000 African-American troops who fought in the Civil War, only about 50,000 were from the North. These soldiers who died at a rate higher than any white soldiers, 50% higher than white casualty rates, came from the South. They came from the border slave states, and they came from the South. And they were recruited as the Union Army marched. Of course, it took a while So did the Declaration. People say, well, I don't, it didn't really free anybody. And my argument is, aside from the people who were freed that very day because of where the army was situated in the Carolinas, neither did the Declaration of Independence. We celebrate July 4th, 1776 as the day of independence, but we weren't freed until the British surrendered. You have to fight for the documents, the liberating documents that you compose. And that's what the Union Army did, both white and black. Yes, sir.
17 days from now, you're going to be doing a presentation that my brother's coming up from Maryland to see because I talked him into it. And he heard you were a Lincoln scholar. He's studied a lot of this stuff. He has a question that he wants to ask at that point, but I wanted to give you a precursor to it.
Oh, okay. He's not coming up to see Ken Burns. He's coming up to see me. Okay.
He said, oh, by the way, there's a Lincoln. There's a Lincoln. Cool, yeah.
Okay, give me the precursor.
Okay, the precursor question is at what point did Lincoln feel that Grant was the man to win the war with sufficient training?
Okay, I have a new answer to that question because there's a new book about 1862, which is a really good book, and I just reviewed it. So I read it really closely. Lincoln hears about Grant in 1862. Grant, it was called 1862, and they changed the title of it, so I can't remember, but it's by a guy named David Van Dreel, Drehle. He wrote that Time magazine cover story this week, or last week. He's a very good writer. But he should have kept it at 1862. It's so much easier. I don't think he did the right thing. Lincoln's Rise to Greatness, something like that. So Lincoln reads about Grant's successes in 1862 at Fort Donelson and Shiloh, obviously, a bloody victory. And he hears this is a guy who can win. He's not as reluctant as McClellan. He's not as fearful of enemy superiority, real or imagined, as McClellan. But Lincoln is cautioned early on by his administrative general, Henry Halleck, who knows the Western theater. And Lincoln really respects Henry Halleck, although later he dismisses him as sort of a glorified clerk. But Henry Halleck is the author of the military strategy and tactics manuals that Lincoln has studied to turn himself in an autodidactic way into a commander-in-chief. So he really respects Halleck's opinion, and he also believes in the chain of command. Halleck's the superior. Halleck says, be careful of this guy. There are rumors are that he drinks too much. The rumors are that his wife owns slaves. The rumors are that he's a Democrat. Lincoln had plenty of Democrats as generals, and he didn't need any more. So when did he conclude that this is a guy who was worth turning over everything to? I think it was entirely political. Lincoln finds out through Illinois political allies of Grant, who he knows well too, that Grant is not going to challenge him in 1864 for the presidency. In January of 64, Abraham Lincoln, by the way, running for re-election nobody had done that since Andrew Jackson, so that in itself was pretty novel and unexpected. But Lincoln did not want competition from his own party, and he hears that Grant, who didn't vote in 1860 but was a Democrat and admitted he would have voted for Stephen Douglas, was being courted by dissident Republicans and Democrats. And he wanted to be absolutely certain that Grant had no political ambitions. By March, it's clear Lincoln finds out that he wants to stay in the military and that he's loyal. The very next month, he meets Grant for the first time, sizes him up, all 5'4" of him, and gives him his stripes to become the first lieutenant general since Winfield Scott, the first permanent lieutenant general since George Washington, and gives him everything. And I think he knew Grant's talents. He didn't believe the drinking stories. Maybe he did say that famous line that's often attributed to him, find out what he's drinking so I can give it to McClellan and the rest of my generals. But he had to, the one thing to keep in mind about Lincoln during the Civil War is that, he never sat down and wrote the Gettysburg Address for a couple of days, and then 2 days later he worked on something else, and then 3 days later his son got sick or something. Everything is happening together. Everything is roiling around together. So politics and the war are inseparable.
Final question, please.
Yes.
With regard to the delegation that was invited to return to Africa and be funded by the federal government, can you imagine for us out loud, or can you tell us what was the national discussion in terms of the financing for that? Big controversy?
No. There was a pot of money, millions of dollars allocated for colonization. It was on the table. Lincoln talked about it as late as December 1862 and then didn't again. And of the money, Lincoln spent only a very small part of it. And in fact, there was one group that volunteered to go to this Chiriquí area, which was a disease-ridden swamp, not the most desirable place to emigrate to. The administration financed a ship and supplies, and within a few months came word that half of the people had died of disease, and they wanted their ship back, and they wanted to come home. Well, Lincoln sent the ship. It was politics. It was harsh, hard, tough politics. And Lincoln never spent the money, it was never going to be mandatory, but he wanted it out there to keep the white voting population in line. It was a step-by-step process. And remember, he doesn't talk about black voting rights until 3 days before he dies. In his final speech, or he thought his first speech on Reconstruction. And when he talks about voting rights for the very educated or those who serve in our army, I mean, we can look at, there's another example of not getting it in terms of 1865. Only for the very educated, that's means testing. That's like what's going on now, where people are told they can't vote without an ID. But it's the first time an American president ever talked about voting rights for African Americans. And there was a man in the audience who, out on the White House lawn, who heard the speech and turned to his friend and said, "That means Negro equality." And he didn't use the word Negro. He said, "That's the last speech he'll ever make." And it was indeed John Wilkes Booth. And 3 days later, he had converted a one-time kidnapping plot into a plan to destroy Abraham Lincoln and any thought of creating a biracial society, which he was on his way to doing, I think. Not one question about Spielberg? Can we just take, does anybody have one? Okay, yes, hi.
The first time, Doris Goodman was on the Charlie Rose show, and she said that James A. Lewis walked and sounded just like Lincoln was supposed to have walked. And my second question...
I know Doris has been around for a long time, but we're all guessing. By the way, the voice, I think, is brilliant. It's so well researched. It's Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois rolled into one. It's high tenor, but piercing tenor, and that's what they described. And the walk, which was very unusual. Lincoln did not walk, heel to toe like everybody else walks. Think about it when you're walking. You walk on your heel, then your toe. Lincoln just picked up his feet and walked like this. And Daniel Day-Lewis has researched that, and he's got that down too. And the slouch, all of it.
And my question is, even though there's been like 14,000 books written on Lincoln...
14,001 because of my new... the young adult companion book to the Spielberg movie called Lincoln. How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America. Go ahead.
Tonight show, they had Sally Field on, but Lincoln. And James Leno said, Lincoln's a real politician. As if it was the first time he ever... My question is, will people look at today's politicians and seeing the movie and having a different viewpoint and maybe...
That's a very good question. I was wondering where you were going with it because I think you're watching entirely too much television. But by the way, Sally Field is unbelievable in this movie. She is so brilliant, and here's what we fought for. We fought in that war not only for freedom and opportunity, but for modern medicine and modern whatever it is that keeps her going, because she is 8 years older than Mary Lincoln was when Mary Lincoln died. She's 25 years older than Mary Lincoln was when she's First Lady. And she still looks better than Mary Lincoln. Sally Field is 70. She's pretty amazing. I mean, she went from doing Depends commercials to doing Mary Lincoln. It's true. She's fabulous. She's going to be nominated for all sorts of awards. So now I've forgotten what your question was. There was a report, widespread reports, that Steven Spielberg did not want this movie issued during the campaign that we just went through. Why? Well, some people said simplistically he didn't want Democrats to be the bad guys and Republicans to be the good guys because he thinks our electorate is so stupid they're not going to get it. That it's not that. People don't think that. But what this movie does show is an executive who knows how to get a fractious Congress to work. This Abraham Lincoln is much more aggressive than you've ever seen him in terms of his relations with the legislature. He pushes. He offers jobs. He does things that are not legal today, not only shady, but not legal. He wants the 13th Amendment passed. And I think my own surmisal is that Mr. Spielberg did not want any unfortunate comparisons made to today's gridlock, because he thought it would be that President Obama would be judged harshly by comparison. I mean, everybody's judged harshly compared to Lincoln. But in fact, and actually they don't even go into some of the things that Lincoln did, which my book does. It's called Lincoln, which I hope kids will get because it's a young adult. It's really supposed to be a young adult book. But here's an example. Lincoln needed, all the people he's working to get to support it are lame duck Democrats, most of them. And guess what they don't have in a few months? Jobs. It's got patronage jobs, judgeships, talks about it. Doesn't really come through a lot. But there are 2 New Jersey congressmen who he wants to get. They don't do this in the movie, but I know it. And these 2 New Jersey congressmen come to him and they say, we have a problem. Charles Sumner, your great friend, the radical Republican anti-slavery man, is in favor of railroad regulation. And he's from Massachusetts, and he's interfering with railroad in New Jersey. And we don't want him to do a regulatory bill about New Jersey railroads. And Lincoln supposedly said, well, we don't have to have a regulatory railroad bill in New Jersey, but we do need to have the Emancipation Proclamation. One of them voted for it, and one of them, a 13th Amendment. One of them voted for it, and one of them was absent. Being absent is almost as good as a no vote because it was only 2/3 of the people in the chamber at the time. So he got a lot of Democrats to not show up for lunch that day, and by hook or by crook, he got it. And I don't know, let's hope that Congress can move again somehow the way Abraham Lincoln moved it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Holzer. We are so grateful that Harold made it up from New York at a time when he has been in incredible demand by the national media as well as the local media, and so it was a very special privilege. We'd like to thank RBC Wealth Management. They have enabled so much of this and have enabled our Civil War exhibition. And for those of you who have not yet seen it, the Emancipation Proclamation was on view today until 5 o'clock. It will be on view tomorrow until 5 o'clock. And so please, if you've not seen it, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I won't say once in a lifetime, but it takes a long time before it happens again. And so please do see it. Guests of RBC Wealth Management, we do have your coats out in the hallway. And on behalf of all of us here at the State Museum, the Office of Cultural Education, which features also the State Library and the State Archives, thank you for coming. Have a good evening.